Okay, so finally, let's get on to the next one, the next recollection. So first off, once again, let's begin. This YouTube series is just a recollection of my past D&D campaigns, so my players have something to remember their adventures. I hope they enjoy it. I take no credit for this campaign setting. I used the sourcebook Explorer's Guide to Wildmount for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, created by the company and show Critical Role. Now, I curated the story using the sourcebook and my players' backstories for this particular campaign. This first campaign I am doing is my most recent and longest campaign. I will do the older campaigns after this, going all the way back to the first campaign. All right, so that's that. Now, let's see here. Okay. All right. So, starting out. Once again, where we pick back up is the party is now just completed their first sort of journey together, right? So we got, essentially, they're kind of getting to know each other, right? They're mixing and mingling, they're learning about one another, and we kind of went over that, how each character sort of explained their basis of their backstory and why they're doing what they're doing. And aside from that, that's whenever the party, this is the next day, they've already done like a long rest and everything, and so they're journeying along the road that follows the Teodan River northward. And what ends up happening is, at some point, what they notice floating down the Teodan River is a collection of humanoid bodies. So they're like, well, something's happening further down that way, flowing back towards them as they're traveling towards these bodies. So they're like, ooh, maybe we should stop the caravan. So they do. And with that, Barrow Stone Turner brings the party together again. He's like, hey, my A-team, here you go. All right, listen, something is going on down that way. I want you guys to go ahead of the caravan and figure out what's going on and make sure it's safe. So with that, the party's like, all right, next adventure, here we go. So they start going down that way. And it's been about an hour of them traveling. I do that a lot. I do everything in hour increments or 30-minute increments, whatever. But they've traveled about an hour, right? So the bodies were floating down for a while. And essentially they see a lone figure standing in the roadway that is watching them approach, right? And he's kind of just spying them. And as they get closer, Knox's kid has really good perception, right? So he can see this guy and he's kind of picking out details about him. And so this guy looks a lot like Vexen, right? He's a green-scaled looking lizard folk. He's got a tail just like Vexen. But he's wearing like he's wearing like plate armor, like actual armor, not light armor, like leather armor and stuff. And upon approaching him, they can see clearly he has this sort of like reddish teeth and like this, like his lower jaw and his throat are all really red, including his teeth and everything. So it kind of looks like he's like drenched in blood from the neck, from the lower jaw down. Anyways, so looking at him, they're like, ooh, and this guy is kind of off-putting. Anyways, they get closer and closer, and once they see him and he starts spying them, he starts to grin, and they're like, ooh, so this guy's kind of off. But turns out he's friendly. And what he explains is, his name is Celastis Redmaw. And he's a lizard folk. And he's basically kind of like he's supposed to be going to this place. He's supposed to be going to what is essentially this river, right? there's a timber guild in Tussoa that sends logs down the river, right? Floating down. And there's supposed to be a checkpoint up ahead that where they kind of collect the logs and stuff, and they mark them and check them and all sorts of stuff. They look for things. And he's one of the guards that is about to be exchanged in the rotation. So anyways, what he does is he noticed the bodies too. So that's the reason why he stopped. And he's been slowly approaching. And the checkpoint is not too far off, but he was kind of just waiting to see if anyone would come by and perhaps aid him. Because he's a lone guy. He's a warrior, but he's alone. So Celastus Redmaw is like, all right, you want to help. I need help. There is something going on in the checkpoint. And I am not so foolish to go myself. So how about it? Help me, and I help you. And so with that, the party's like, yeah, why not? All right, what's it called? We got some extra help from this guy. Let's go and check it out. So essentially what they do is, after explaining this to them, they know that, all right, so this guy seemingly doesn't seem like a bad guy, right? They do some insight checks on him to try and figure out if he's like a bandit or if he's lying to them or something. He's a bad liar. They didn't roll very high, but they could tell that this guy wasn't lying. So they're like, okay. So he's being completely truthful. For the most part, from what they can tell. So, anyways, what they do is they start making their way down the road. And eventually what they find is the checkpoint itself. And it's kind of like a big stone structure that has this kind of like sluice bridge that goes across the way where like it catches the logs and everything. And so upon approach, they're like, okay, let's take it easy. There's no signs of life. No one's doing anything. There's no guards, nothing. And so as they're making their way over to it, they see that the great door is slightly ajar. So they're like, all right, something happened, clearly. And so as they make their way over, Vexen's like, hold on. Send in Xander. So Xander goes up first, and it's very dark. Xander's looking for traps, and he's like, why would they trap a municipal checkpoint? He's like, looks in. He doesn't find anything, but it's very dark, and he's like, I feel like something could ambush us if we go in there. So that's whenever Vexen's like, all right, let's do this. Let's back everyone up. Let's form a line, and let's try and lure anything in there out. Because if we go in there, we're at its mercy. But out here, at least we can run for it. And so, essentially, Ax's kid is like, hey, come here! And at that point, what comes running out is a bunch of roaring, wide-eyed humanoids that have like bite marks on them and all sorts of blood dripping off them. They're basically running zombies. Or in this case, they're called zombie husk. And so, at least that's what they are in the monster manual, a particular monster manual. And so they come out running. They're not too strong. They're quite weak. And that's what they discover pretty quickly. The zombies come running out and they jump on them. And that's kind of like their thing. They just kind of grab onto them. And so they're like, what the? They just like knock them off. I didn't look too much at their stat block, but that was kind of their thing. And so he's just like, okay, let's go through and start clearing these guys out. They make pretty short work of them. They hit them with a bunch of arrows and eldritch blasts on the way in. And once they actually start latching on to people, people are like, just knock them off. It was quick. It was easy. I didn't think too much about it whenever I was first looking at them. I thought, ooh, zombies that run. Cool. Anyways, Dungeon Master mistakes. That's the sort of stuff that will happen. But they start going in, and they basically start clearing out this checkpoint. They are being very careful, and they're going from room to room, fighting little packs of husk zombies. And they're like, okay, what is called? They're essentially solving the story of what happened here. Something came in from the outside, and the workers of the checkpoint were like barricading themselves, trying to fend off husk zombies or their fellow workers that turned into husk zombies. And so they're basically just clearing them out. And finally they get far to the other, basically clear to the other side, where there is like a kind of like a storage area where they keep a lot of tools and stuff like that, and weapons and such. So once they get there, they find that there are 2 survivors that are barricaded in the room, and they're like, hey man, come on out, all right? And they're like, no, we don't want to. There's monsters out there. And there's like, yeah, we cleared them all out. And he's like, did you get the big one? And there's like, big one? And that's whenever they start asking questions. They're like, hey, is there another one? Or is there some big running husk zombie? And he's like, no, there isn't. There's a big demonic toad. And then they're like, oh, well, we didn't see that. And then through more questioning, they discover that they are, in fact, in the this creature apparently made its way to kind of like the control, like gear, the mechanism room, where that controls the checkpoint's sluice mechanism that catches the logs and everything. And they say, that's the last time they heard where it was, right? Through their harrowing journey. And so essentially what ends up happening is they're like, okay, well, now we know where it is. The 2 survivors tell them where they need to go. And so they're not opening up until that thing's gone. So anyways, it's Elastus, he's like, well, we have to deal with this. Otherwise, I don't get my money. And so they're like, all right. So they're going to help him. They promised to help him, so they're going to finish what they started. So they go and they make their way towards the staircase that leads to these this mechanism room. And what they discover is like, okay, they are somewhere. This thing is somewhere in here. And from what they described, it's a big toad. Can't be that hard to find. Well, it was. They open up the door, and Xander goes in first, right? Checking for traps and everything. And essentially, what ends up happening is there's some husk zombies in there, right? So immediately the fight breaks out with the husk zombies. But what ends up happening is that thing, the demonic toad, which is in the game called a Nergalid. Crazy name. But anyways, that thing is waiting in the corner of the room, right? And it's because of all the mechanism stuff, it's really confined spaces. So the party is moving in there, and a lot of them are kind of trapped in the hallway that leads into the room. So only a couple guys get in there. Xander, behind him is, Vexen. And even though he's kind of a frontline fighter, Celastus is all the way in the back. So they have to like all funnel into the room and then eventually get in there together. And the problem with that room is fighting not only the husk zombies, the Nergalid. A lot of them are ranged fighters, so they are up close and personal. So they're fighting. They have a lot of range attacks that they're using at disadvantage because they're facing like the enemy and they're within like melee distance. So it's a little bit of a tougher fight, but as with most things, the party is able to sort of gang up and overwhelm the Nergalid. And with Celastus' help, he's a frontline fighter, so he actually takes a lot of the brunt of the damage. But the party is successful in defeating the Nergalid, and they're like, all right, we're done. And can't really do too much looting because, one, I mean, they can loot the body of the Nurglud, but they can't really, like, loot the place because it's a municipal sort of, like, it belongs to, like, the guilds and stuff like that between Tussoa and Port Damali, so it's not, they can't just go through and just loot the place. So they're like, all right, well, we'll take a couple things here and there. And Celastus is like watching them, like, hey, don't touch that. And they're like, all right, we won't, but we're going to loot him. So they do that. And essentially, what ends up happening is they get a couple things, but mostly what they get is a paid reward or the promise of payment. So essentially, Celastus takes them back and they meet the survivors. The survivors come out and basically they kind of negotiate a deal like, hey, whenever you get to Tussoa, let them know that you did this. We'll sign this and yeah, make sure you guys get paid for doing this. I'm like, all right, fine. But from there, the party's like, okay, let's go ahead and essentially make our way back to the caravan. And they basically explain, we'll send people back from Tussoa once we get there. We'll let them know that you guys are in need of assistance. And so from there, the party's like, all right, we'll do that. We'll do that. So with that, the party essentially goes, leaves and says, their goodbyes to Celastus and the two survivors. They're not important. And then they make their way back to the caravan. They explain everything to Barrow Stone Turner, and so they move onward and eventually pass the checkpoint where Celastus and the two survivors are over there kind of clearing out bodies and moving out debris and fixing things. And, in the end, saying like, hey, see ya. And they keep going all the way to Tussoa. And from there, that's pretty much the end of the session. A lot of the session was them just clearing each of these areas of husk zombies. And, yeah, it was pretty standard. No traps really to worry about, stuff like that. And I was kind of learning, I was like, I need to pay a little bit more attention to the monster stat blocks before I utilize certain monsters. Because sometimes they're kind of underwhelming. But with that, the party makes their way to the outside of Tussoa, and that is where that session, or that recollection, ends, and where the next one will begin. So with that, we are on to the next one. So until then, all right, take care.